Rome did not fall the day a barbarian entered its gates. By the time that happened, the real transformation had already taken place. Long before emperors wore purple and commanded legions across 3 continents, Rome was something smaller and in some ways more fragile, a republic of citizens who believed they had solved the problem of power. They had expelled their kings and sworn never again to bow to one man. Authority would be divided, offices would be temporary, ambition would be contained by law. For a time it worked. Welcome to the history of the world, where we explain how power rises, how systems endure, and how empires fall. When the Roman Republic was established in the late 6th century before Christ, it was little more than a regional city-state among rivals in central Italy. Its political design was cautious and deliberate. 2 consuls held executive authority, but only for a year. The Senate advised and guided policy, but it was not a monarch's court. Popular assemblies voted. Magistrates rotated. No single figure was meant to dominate the system. This structure was not born from idealism. It was born from fear of tyranny. Rome's last king had been expelled, and the memory of monarchy lingered as a warning. The Republic was constructed as a mechanism to prevent concentration of power. And yet, the very system designed to restrain ambition began to reward it. In its early centuries, Rome fought defensively against neighboring tribes and rival cities. Victory brought security. Security brought alliances. Rome developed a habit of incorporating defeated communities rather than destroying them outright. Some were granted limited rights. Others became allies obligated to provide soldiers. Instead of ruling through permanent occupation, Rome wove its rivals into a broader network of obligation. It was efficient. It multiplied manpower without multiplying resentment. As Roman influence spread across the Italian peninsula, the Republic's political machinery continued to function as if it were still managing a single city. Consuls were elected annually. Citizens served in the army and then returned to their farms. Military service was tied to land ownership. A farmer defended the state because he was part of it. Then Rome encountered a rival of a different scale. Across the Mediterranean lay Carthage, wealthy, naval, commercially dominant. The conflict that followed would last for decades and reshape Rome's destiny. The wars against Carthage were brutal and prolonged. At one point, a Carthaginian general marched elephants across the Alps and ravaged Italy itself. Rome nearly collapsed. It did not. When the struggle finally ended, Carthage was destroyed, and Rome stood unchallenged in the western Mediterranean. Sicily, Spain, North Africa. Territories once foreign were now Roman provinces. Wealth flowed into the city in quantities previously unimaginable. Gold, silver, slaves, land. Victory felt like confirmation. The Republic had endured its greatest test. But something fundamental had changed. The Republic had been built to manage a city-state with regional alliances. It now governed distant provinces, separated by sea. Governors were dispatched to administer these territories. Armies remained stationed abroad for extended periods. Commands that had once lasted a year now stretched far longer. Success in war brought not only honor, but immense personal wealth. The incentives shifted. Military command became the fastest route to political power. Ambitious men competed for opportunities to conquer. Conquest brought prestige. Prestige brought votes. Votes brought further command. Expansion was no longer simply defensive. It was self-reinforcing. Meanwhile, the social fabric within Italy began to fray. Conquests abroad flooded Rome with slaves, who were put to work on vast estates owned by the wealthy. Small farmers, once the backbone of the citizen army, but struggled to compete. Many sold their land and drifted into the city, swelling an urban population dependent on grain distributions and political patronage. The Republic had created prosperity. It had also created imbalance. In the late 2nd century before Christ, attempts were made to address the growing inequality. Reformers proposed redistributing public land to restore the class of small farmers. The debates were heated. The opposition was fierce. Political violence erupted in the streets of Rome itself. For generations, Romans had prided themselves on resolving conflict through procedure. Now, senators were clubbing rivals to death in public assemblies. Norms that had once been sacred became negotiable. The system did not collapse. It adjusted, but not toward restraint. Military reform followed. Faced with manpower shortages, Rome began allowing landless citizens to enlist in the legions. Soldiers were no longer primarily property-owning farmers, temporarily defending their homeland. They became professionals. They served for long terms. And when their service ended, they expected compensation, often in the form of land granted by their commander. Loyalty began to shift subtly. The Senate paid the army, but the general led it, rewarded it, and often enriched it. The change was gradual. It did not announce itself as revolution. It felt practical. Rome needed soldiers. Soldiers needed incentives. But beneath the surface, a transformation was underway. Generals who commanded legions for years developed bonds stronger than civic oath. Ambition grew sharper. One commander, Sulla, marched his army not against a foreign enemy, but against Rome itself. The unthinkable had happened. A Roman general using Roman soldiers to seize political control of the Republic. He justified it as necessary. Many did. From that moment, precedent shifted. If one general could march on Rome to restore order, another could do the same. Julius Caesar would eventually test that logic fully. After years of conquest in Gaul, his legions were loyal, hardened, and victorious. When ordered to disband and return as a private citizen, he faced a choice. Surrender his command and risk political ruin, or cross the boundary that tradition forbade. He crossed it. Civil war followed. Caesar emerged dominant. He accumulated titles and honors, culminating in the role of dictator for life. It was a position that resembled the monarchy Rome had once rejected. He was assassinated for it. And yet, killing Caesar did not restore the Republic. It accelerated its unraveling. More civil wars erupted. More armies chose sides. The language of republican virtue persisted, but the machinery of power had shifted irreversibly. Eventually, Caesar's adopted heir, Octavian, later known as Augustus, prevailed. He understood something his predecessors had not fully grasped. Rome no longer needed a republic in practice, it needed stability, but Romans still feared kings. So Augustus did not declare himself one. He preserved the outward forms of the republic. The Senate met, magistrates were elected, traditions remained, yet real authority flowed through him. The army answered to him. Provincial administration was reorganized under his oversight. Power was centralized carefully, quietly. The republic did not end in a proclamation. It faded into something else. At the time, this seemed reasonable. The old system had produced chaos. A single guiding figure promised peace, and for a long while he delivered it. Augustus did not announce a revolution, he arranged one. After decades of civil war, Romans did not crave ideology. They craved calm. Fields had been burned, armies had marched across Italy. Political alliances had dissolved into bloodshed. Stability, even at the cost of tradition, began to feel like a fair exchange. Augustus understood that power in Rome had always depended as much on perception as on force. He kept the Senate intact. He refused the title of king. He called himself princeps, first citizen, a phrase that sounded modest enough to calm suspicion. But beneath the language of continuity, authority flowed through him in ways the Republic had never permitted. He controlled the legions. He held long-term command over key provinces where most of the army was stationed. He oversaw finances. He appointed governors. The state still had offices and elections, but the center of gravity had shifted permanently. What followed was not chaos, it was structure. The first 2 centuries of imperial rule are often described as Rome's golden age. Roads linked distant provinces. Trade moved grain from Egypt to Italy, wine from Gaul to Britain, silk from the east toward the Mediterranean. Citizenship gradually expanded beyond Italy, binding elites across the empire into a shared political identity. Roman law became more systematic. Bureaucracy deepened. Administration became more professional. The empire worked because it adapted. Local customs were often tolerated so long as taxes were paid and order maintained. Provincial elites were incorporated rather than erased. Military frontiers were fortified but not constantly expanding. The emperor stood as final authority, but much daily governance remained local. It was an extraordinary achievement, a Mediterranean world held together not only by force, but by predictable administration. But scale carries a price. As the empire expanded north into Britain and east toward the Euphrates, borders lengthened. Defending them required permanent legions stationed far from Rome. Those legions required steady pay. Steady pay required reliable taxation. Reliable taxation required efficient collection across vast distances. The machinery grew heavier. Under emperors such as Trajan, Rome reached its greatest territorial extent. Victory brought prestige, but it also brought new frontiers to defend. Conquest had once financed itself through plunder. Now the cost of maintaining distant provinces began to outweigh their immediate returns. The logic of expansion shifted from opportunity to obligation. Meanwhile, succession remained a vulnerability. Augustus had stabilized power, but he had not solved the problem of inheritance in a system that rejected kingship, yet depended on singular authority. Some emperors adopted capable heirs, others relied on bloodline. Occasionally the army simply chose. When emperors were competent, as under Trajan, Hadrian, or Marcus Aurelius, the system held. When they were not, instability rippled outward. The 2nd century closed with Marcus Aurelius, a philosopher-emperor who spent much of his reign defending frontiers against Germanic tribes. His death marked more than the end of a ruler. It marked the end of a period in which imperial leadership had been unusually steady. His son Commodus inherited the throne. The contrast was sharp. Governance became erratic. Court politics intensified. Assassination returned as a political instrument. After Commodus was killed, the empire entered a cycle that revealed its structural weakness. In one chaotic year, several emperors rose and fell in rapid succession. The imperial throne was, at one point, effectively auctioned to the highest bidder by the Praetorian Guard. The army, once protector of the state, had become kingmaker. It seemed practical at the time. Soldiers wanted reliable leadership and pay. They supported those who promised it. But beneath the surface, legitimacy was eroding. The 3rd century brought compounded pressures. External threats intensified. Germanic tribes pressed along the Rhine and Danube. In the east, the Sasanian Persian Empire replaced Parthia and proved more formidable. Plague reduced population and manpower. Trade contracted. Tax revenues strained. Emperors responded as systems often do under stress, by centralizing further. Military spending increased. Coinage was debased to stretch silver supplies, leading to inflation. Administrative divisions multiplied. The empire was briefly split into separate eastern and western regimes before being reunited. The structure held, but it held differently. Diocletian, at the end of the 3rd century, reorganized the empire dramatically. He divided authority among multiple emperors in a system known as the Tetrarchy, attempting to address the impossibility of one man ruling such vast territory effectively. He reformed taxation and strengthened bureaucratic oversight. Controls on prices and professions were imposed in an effort to stabilize the economy. It was comprehensive. It was ambitious. It was also an admission. The empire that Augustus had shaped for stability could no longer function through informal authority alone. It required rigid administration. It required compulsion. Under Constantine, the capital shifted eastward to Byzantium, renamed Constantinople. The center of gravity moved closer to wealthier eastern provinces and away from Rome itself. Christianity, once persecuted, became increasingly intertwined with imperial identity. The empire adapted again. For a time, these reforms sustained it, but scale, once again, pressed relentlessly. The western half of the empire grew comparatively poorer and more exposed. Military recruitment increasingly relied on federated barbarian groups settled within imperial borders. They were allies, until they were not. In the 5th century, Rome itself was sacked more than once. In 476, a Germanic general deposed the last Western emperor. It is tempting to treat that moment as the end. It was not. The eastern half of the empire, what we now call the Byzantine Empire, endured for nearly another 1,000 years. Roman law, administration, and imperial ideology persisted. The Roman state did not vanish, it transformed, which raises a more unsettling question. If Rome did not collapse in a single moment, what exactly failed? The Republic had failed to contain the consequences of its own expansion. The empire had succeeded in stabilizing power, but at the cost of concentrating it. As long as leadership was competent and revenue sufficient, the structure held. When pressures multiplied, economic, military, demographic, rigidity replaced flexibility. Systems built to endure often adapt until adaptation becomes exhaustion. Across centuries, the same pattern repeats. A political structure designed for one scale achieves success. Success expands scale. Expanded scale strains original design. Reform centralizes authority. Stability returns, temporarily. Over time, complexity increases. Costs rise. External shocks reveal internal fragility. None of this felt inevitable at the time. Romans living under Augustus believed they had achieved lasting peace. Citizens under Trajan saw expansion as glory. Administrators under Diocletian believed reform could solve structural strain. Each generation experienced its present as manageable. The long arc only becomes visible afterward. Rome became an empire because its republican framework could not govern a Mediterranean world without descending into internal conflict. Centralized authority solved that problem. It created centuries of order, law, and integration. But the same scale that required an emperor also demanded perpetual resources, perpetual military vigilance, and perpetual administrative refinement. The empire was not undone by a single invasion. It was worn down by accumulation, of commitments, of complexity, of cost. It could not stay what it had become, because what it had become required conditions that could not be permanently sustained. Power rises by solving problems. It endures by managing consequences. It falls when the consequences outpace the capacity to manage them. Rome solved the problem of instability by creating empire. It solved the problem of succession imperfectly. It solved the problem of administration through bureaucracy. Each solution carried weight. Over centuries, the weight accumulated, and yet Rome did not vanish. Its language, law, infrastructure, and political ideas survived in fragments across Europe and the Mediterranean. The empire's physical borders contracted, but its institutional legacy endured, which may be the final irony. Rome could not remain an empire, but it could not stop being Rome either. The past is quiet, but it's never done speaking. Subscribe to the history of the world, because understanding how it worked is the first step to understanding where we are now.